night my mother-in-law handed me a glass of champagne at her annual Christmas dinner, she was smiling so warmly I almost believed she had finally accepted me. I was 7 weeks pregnant. I hadn't told anyone yet except my husband. And I was terrified, but also quietly thrilled in that secret way that makes your whole chest feel like it's glowing from the inside. I took the glass from her hands, looked down at the bubbles rising to the surface, and said, "Actually, I can't. I'm pregnant." The smile on her face didn't disappear. It shifted. There's a difference, and I will never forget it. It moved from something warm into something calculated, like a door closing behind a lock you didn't know was there. She set her own glass down on the white tablecloth very carefully, looked at my husband sitting across from me, and said, "Congratulations." But she was looking at him, not me. That should have been my first warning. My name is Vivian, and I am 31 years old. At the time this story begins, I was a licensed CPA working at a mid-size accounting firm in suburban Ohio. I'd married my husband, whose name I'll call my husband, 3 years earlier in a small outdoor ceremony in September. He was kind when we were dating, thoughtful. He remembered small things, brought me coffee exactly the way I liked it, showed up when he said he would. I was 27 when we got married, and I thought I understood who he was. I didn't fully understand who his mother was, and by the time I did, it almost cost me everything. My mother-in-law was a woman who had spent 30 years building a version of her family that was entirely centered on herself. She had 2 children, my husband and his younger sister, and she had raised them both to believe that her approval was the only kind that mattered. My husband had inherited his grandfather's estate when his grandfather died 2 years before we met. The estate included a property in rural Virginia, a brokerage account worth approximately $400,000 at the time, and a small business interest that had since grown considerably. My mother-in-law had been the executor of that estate. She had managed the accounts for the 3 years it took to settle everything, and she had made it very, very clear to my husband that this money was, in her words, a family legacy. Not his, not ours, a family legacy. When I became pregnant, something shifted in her. I didn't understand it at first. I told myself she was just old-fashioned, or nervous, or protective in the way that some mothers are when their sons start building their own lives. I made excuses for her the way you do when you desperately want to believe the best in the people around you. But the calls started coming. She would phone my husband in the evenings, always when I was in the other room, always just long enough for the conversation to end before I walked back in. Once I picked up the extension by accident. We still had a landline in the kitchen, an old habit, and I heard her say, "She's going to use this baby to lock down access to everything your grandfather left you." My husband said, "Mom." Just that, just her name in a tired voice, like a period at the end of a sentence he'd already written 100 times. He didn't tell me about that call. I found out I was having twins at 12 weeks. My OB was wonderful, calm, steady, the kind of person who makes you feel like everything is under control even when it isn't. She told me both heartbeats were strong, handed me the grainy black and white image, and I sat in the parking lot of the medical building and cried for 20 minutes because I was so happy. I texted my husband a photo of the ultrasound. He called me back in under a minute and his voice cracked when he said, "2?" That was the last genuinely good moment we had for a very long time. My mother-in-law hosted a family dinner in February to celebrate the pregnancy officially. It was her idea. She'd invited my husband's sister, 2 of her closest friends who were practically family, and my own parents, who drove in from Cincinnati. The house was beautiful the way her house always was. Fresh flowers in every room, candles on the dining table, everything arranged as if she'd hired a stylist. I wore a soft green dress. I felt for the first time in weeks like maybe I had been reading into things too much. Dinner was fine, warm even. My mother-in-law told a story about my husband as a little boy that made everyone laugh. My mother squeezed my hand under the table. I ate too much of the roasted chicken and felt the twins move for what I was fairly sure was the first time, or maybe it was just nerves, but I remember pressing my hand flat against my stomach under the table and thinking, "We're going to be okay." After dessert, my mother-in-law asked me to help her carry some dishes to the kitchen. This was not unusual. I'd done it a dozen times. I followed her through the swinging door, set the plates in the sink, and turned around to find her standing very close to me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. She said, "I need you to understand something." I said, "Okay." She said, "Those children will inherit everything my father-in-law built. That means they will be raised properly with the values of this family in this family, not in some apartment in Columbus because you decided you wanted a career instead of a home." I stared at her. I said, "I'm sorry, what?" She said, "I've already spoken to an estate attorney. If you continue working, if you insist on this arrangement where my son is essentially a secondary parent in his own household, I will advise him to restructure the trust in a way that protects the family's interests." I want to be precise about what happened next because I have thought about it many times. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I looked at her very steadily and said, "This is a conversation for me and my husband to have, not for you and me." Then I picked up a dish towel, set it on the counter, and walked back out to the dining room. She followed me out 30 seconds later, completely composed, and offered everyone a second glass of wine. I told my husband that night when we got home. I told him exactly what she'd said, word for word, because I have a good memory for things that frighten me. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She's been worried about the estate. She doesn't mean it the way it sounds." I said, "She said it exactly the way it sounds." He said, "Vivian, she's my mother." That sentence. I have turned it over so many times since. She's my mother. As if that were an answer. As if that were anything at all. I want to be fair here. My husband was not a cruel man. He was a man who had been trained his entire life to manage his mother's feelings before his own, and by extension before anyone else's. He genuinely believed that accommodation was love, that smoothing things over was the same as solving them. He had been doing it so long he couldn't see how much damage the smoothing was hiding. I started keeping a journal in March. Not because I thought I'd need it, but because I needed somewhere to put what I was feeling. I wrote down the kitchen conversation in detail. I wrote down a dinner in April where my mother-in-law referred to the twins as the heirs, 3 times in one sentence. I wrote down the afternoon in May when I came home to find her in our house. She had a spare key my husband had never asked back, going through the files in the second bedroom we designated as the nursery. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was organizing. The files she'd been looking through were the brokerage statements. My husband, when I told him, said she was just trying to help. In June, at 22 weeks, I had a complicated scare. Cervical length issue, nothing ultimately serious, but I was on modified bed rest for 2 weeks and I was frightened in the specific, exhausting way that you are frightened when you are responsible for 2 lives that haven't been born yet. My mother-in-law offered to come stay with us to help. I said no. I was not gracious about it. My husband was unhappy with me. That was the first time I clearly understood that in his hierarchy, her feelings about being excluded outweighed my need to feel safe in my own home. I hired an estate attorney of my own in July. Her name was Heather. I'm using her real first name because she was wonderful and I want credit to go where it's due. And she specialized in marital property law and trust disputes. I brought my journal. I brought the brokerage statements I'd photographed with my phone before my mother-in-law replaced the files where she'd found them. I explained everything from the beginning. Heather listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You're right to be concerned. Has your husband added you to any of the estate accounts?" I said no. She said, "Does he know you're here?" I said no. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." I also installed a small security camera at the front door and one in the kitchen of our home. I told my husband about the front door camera because I framed it as a safety measure with the pregnancy. I did not tell him about the kitchen one. I know how that sounds. I want you to understand that by this point, I had documented 3 instances of my mother-in-law entering our home without permission, and on one occasion moving financial paperwork. I was not being paranoid. I was being precise. The situation broke open in August. My husband's sister came to visit from Portland for a long weekend. She and I had always been cordial, not close. She was 3 years younger than my husband, sharper in some ways, harder in others. She arrived on a Friday afternoon, and by Saturday morning, something was wrong. I could feel it. She and my husband had a long conversation in the backyard that I watched through the kitchen window without being able to hear. And when they came back inside, she wouldn't look at me directly. Saturday night, my mother-in-law came for dinner. I had not been informed she was coming. I was 30 weeks pregnant, tired from a week of work, and I sat at my own dinner table and listened to my mother-in-law tell my husband, in front of his sister, in front of me, that she had concerns about paternity and that she thought for everyone's sake a prenatal paternity test would settle things. The room was very quiet. I looked at my husband. He did not look at me. He looked at his plate. I said, I'd like everyone who is not my husband to leave my house. My mother-in-law said that she was trying to protect her son. I said, he is a grown man and I am his wife and I am carrying his children and I am asking you to leave. She did not move immediately. She did not move immediately. She looked at my husband and said, you see how she is. He said, Mom, maybe. I stood up from the table. I was 30 weeks pregnant and I stood up very slowly and I pointed at the door. They left. Both of them, my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law, walked out of my house, and I heard the car doors close in the driveway, and I sat back down and looked at my husband. He said, she's just scared about the estate. I said, your mother just accused me of infidelity at my own dinner table in front of your sister, and you said, maybe. He opened his mouth and closed it. I said, I need you to understand that I have been documenting everything since February. I need you to understand that I have spoken to an attorney, and I need you to understand that I love you and I want to save our marriage, but I cannot save it alone. He cried that night. First time I had ever seen him cry. He said he was sorry. He said he knew his mother had gone too far. He said he would handle it. I believed him. I still don't know if that was foolish or just human. He did not handle it. The following week, while I was at a regular prenatal appointment, my mother-in-law came to the house. I know this because the kitchen camera caught her. She used her key. She was in our house for 47 minutes. She went to the second bedroom, the nursery, and she went through the small filing cabinet where we kept household documents. What she was looking for, I later found out from Heather, was any document that named me as a beneficiary or joint account holder on the estate accounts. She didn't find any because there weren't any. My husband had never added me, but she also went through my personal desk in the corner of the room, and she found my journal. She took photographs of several pages with her phone. I know this because the camera caught her holding it up, page by page, face angled in concentration. She did not take the journal. She put it back exactly where it was. She was, I have to say, extremely careful. She didn't know about the camera. 3 days later, my husband came to me with printed photographs, screenshots, actually, of my journal pages. He set them on the kitchen table and said, my mother found these. I looked at them. Then I looked at him. Then I said, your mother broke into our home, went through my private belongings, and photographed my personal journal, and you are showing me the photographs. He said, Vivian, some of the things you wrote. I said, stop. I went to my phone. I opened the camera app. I showed him 47 minutes of footage of his mother moving through our house, our personal files, my private desk. He sat down on the kitchen floor. I had never seen him do that before. Just sat down on the floor with his back against the cabinet and put his head in his hands. I called Heather from the bedroom. She said, send me the footage tonight. I went into early labor at 34 weeks. Stress-induced, my OB said, which is a polite medical way of saying that what had happened to me over the previous 8 months had caught up with my body. The twins were born small, but strong. A girl and a boy. They were in the NICU for 9 days, which were 9 of the longest days of my life, and I sat beside those little isolates and talked to them for hours and told them all the things I was going to make sure they had. I told my daughter she would never have to explain herself to anyone who hadn't earned the right to question her. I told my son that being a good man meant standing next to the people you love, even when it costs you something. My husband came to the hospital. He was there every day. He held both babies. He cried again, quietly, looking at them through the NICU window, And I watched him and thought about the man I had married and the man he had become, and whether those were the same man or two different people living in the same body. My mother-in-law came to the hospital on day 2. She was not on the approved visitor list. The NICU has strict visitor protocols. This is real, this is policy, this is not a loophole. And when she was told she could not come in, she called my husband and told him to fix it. He called the nurses' station. The charge nurse, a formidable woman named Deborah, who I will be grateful to until I die, told him clearly that visitor restrictions were for medical reasons and were not negotiable. My mother-in-law left. My sister-in-law posted on Facebook that day that she was devastated to be kept from her niece and nephew. 46 people liked it. Heather had been busy while I was in the hospital. She had filed an emergency motion regarding the estate accounts, citing documented evidence of unauthorized access to marital property and potential financial coercion. She had also sent a formal letter to my mother-in-law's attorney, because yes, she had one, detailing the security footage and its implications under Ohio law regarding unauthorized entry. My mother-in-law's attorney called Heather back within 24 hours. When I came home from the hospital with the twins, my husband and I had a long, quiet conversation at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning while both babies slept. He said he had spoken to his own therapist. He'd started seeing one 3 weeks earlier, which I had not known, and that he understood now that he had failed me in ways that were serious and real. He said he was not asking me to forgive him immediately or to pretend things were fine. He said he wanted to try to be the person I had thought I was marrying. I told him I needed to see actions, not intentions. I told him his mother would not have unsupervised access to my children. I told him the estate accounts needed to be restructured with me named as a co-trustee before I would consider any conversation about moving forward as a couple. He said yes to all of it. Whether he meant it or could sustain it was something only time would answer. What I know is this. My mother-in-law was cited by the local sheriff's department for criminal trespass 2 months after the twins came home. The security footage was unambiguous. Her attorney negotiated it down to a civil matter, which resulted in a restraining order. She is not permitted within 100 feet of our home or my children's school or daycare. The estate accounts were restructured in October, with full legal documentation naming me as co-trustee with equal access and decision-making authority. Heather reviewed every line. I reviewed every line. My husband signed willingly, in person, in front of a notary. My sister-in-law sent me a long email in November saying that I had destroyed the family. I read it once and then I archived it. I did not respond. There is a category of message that does not require a response, and that was it. I went back to work in January, 4 months after the twins were born. And the first morning I walked into my office with my coffee and sat down at my desk and opened my laptop, I felt something I hadn't felt in almost a year. I felt like myself, like the specific version of myself that existed before I had spent 8 months being told, in various ways, that who I was and what I had built was a threat to someone else's interests. I am telling you this story not because I want you to hate my mother-in-law. Hate is a very expensive emotion, and I can't afford it anymore. I'm telling you because for a long time I sat with the question of whether I had done something wrong, whether setting boundaries was aggression, whether protecting my children was selfishness, whether demanding equal standing in my own marriage and my own home was somehow unreasonable. It wasn't, and it isn't. The hardest thing I have ever learned is that some people will call your boundaries an attack because they were counting on your silence. Your silence was the plan. When you stop being silent, you become the problem in their version of the story. That's not your version. You don't have to live in their version. My daughter is 14 months old now. My son is 14 months old. They let me leave relied and curious and completely unaware that anything unusual happened before they arrived in the world. They pull themselves up on the coffee table and fall down and pull themselves up again with complete confidence that falling is not the end of anything. They understand, intuitively, something I spent 31 years learning. If my story reached something in you, if you are sitting right now in a home where you have been made to feel like a guest, where your voice is tolerated but not heard, where the people who are supposed to protect you have quietly, consistently chosen someone else, I want you to know that the floor is solid. You can sit down on it and figure out your next move. You do not have to stay standing in someone else's structure waiting for it to hold you. Come back next week. I'll be here. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the dramatic ones, not the camera footage or the restraining order or the morning Heather called to tell me the motion had gone through. The moment I keep coming back to is much smaller than that. It's me sitting in the NICU at 2 in the morning, one hand through the porthole of my daughter's isolette, the other resting on the edge of my son's, and thinking, I did not let them take this from me. That thought didn't come from anger. It came from somewhere quieter. Something I had to earn. I used to believe that being a good person meant absorbing what was thrown at you without complaint, that patience was the same as strength, that if I just stayed calm and stayed reasonable and stayed kind, the people around me would eventually respond in kind. What I learned, slowly, painfully, through months of journal entries and attorney consultations and security camera footage, is that decency is not a shield. It is a standard you hold yourself to. It does not obligate anyone else to meet you there. My mother-in-law was not an evil person in the way that word gets used carelessly. She was a frightened person who had spent 30 years organizing her world around control, and when I arrived in her son's life and refused to be organized, she treated that refusal as a threat. Understanding that didn't make what she did acceptable, but it helped me stop waiting for an apology that was never coming, and start focusing on what I could actually build. The thing I'm most grateful for, and I've thought about this a lot, is that I stayed clear-headed when it would have been so much easier not to. I kept the journal. I hired Heather before I had any proof I'd need her. I installed the camera, not out of suspicion, but out of a quiet, persistent sense that I needed to be able to trust what I knew, rather than just what I felt. That kind of thinking doesn't come naturally when you're 30 weeks pregnant and exhausted and the person you married keeps choosing someone else over you. It is a choice you make again and again in small moments to stay sharp when everything in you wants to just collapse. And then there is the matter what my husband had to face. I will not pretend that was easy to watch. He had to look at 47 minutes of footage of his mother walking through our home, through our files, through my private desk, and he had to decide what that meant about the story he'd been telling himself for 30 years. That is not a small reckoning. The men and women who do that work, who actually sit down on the floor and let the truth land, are doing something that takes real moral weight to carry. He is still doing it. I am still watching to see if it holds. What I want to leave you with is this. The outcomes in my story were not random. My mother-in-law is under a restraining order because she made choices, one after another, that could not be undone. My name is on the estate documents because I refused to accept a version of my own marriage where I was a guest. My children are safe and healthy and laughing in my living room because I did not wait for someone to give me permission to protect them. None of that came from luck. It came from paying attention, thinking carefully, and refusing to quit. You already have those things. The question is whether you'll use them before the cost gets higher than it needs to be.